Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big and interesting stories in the region. My name is Amrin Zaman, and today I'll be examining the latest round of violence between members of the Druze community in Syria against forces allied with the government of interim President Ahmed al-Shara. At least 16 people were killed in clashes near Damascus that began at the beginning of this week. The fighting erupted in two Druze majority suburbs near Damascus after a video attributed to a Druze cleric who insulted the Prophet Muhammad began circulating on social media. The cleric has denied any responsibility, and the Interior Ministry cleared him. However, Israel has intervened, striking what it called operatives who it says attacked Druze civilians. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged to protect Syria's Druze, but many believe his government's real agenda is to weaken Syria's new Islamist-led government and to deepen ethnic and religious fissures in the country. With us here to discuss these developments is Makram Rabah, an assistant professor of history at the American University of Beirut, who has written extensively about the Druze question. So welcome to our program, Makram.
Thank you for having me.
So we have a fresh outburst of violence between government forces and the Druze community, but it's really not that straightforward. There are different Druze actors. Could you kindly explain to our audience who the stakeholders are and why is there this new round of violence?
Well, one has to start by identifying who are the Druze. The Druze are a kind of a super tribe which exists across Levant, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and they go back centuries. In the case of Lebanon and Syria, they played an instrumental role in the state building of these countries. In Israel, while they are powerful because they are incorporated within the Israeli state and they serve in the army and they occupy high-ranking positions, their numbers make them somewhat less important. What's happening right now is that there are some Druze pockets around Damascus which have been in confrontation with the Shara, with the new Syrian regime forces. However, the clashes are not straightforward because they're not only fighting with the official forces of the new regime, but rather some of what the Druze consider to be extremist Muslim radicals, people who were part and parcel of Abu Muhammad al-Julani's faction before he became Ahmad Shara. The problem becomes more and more complicated when the Lebanese Druze and the Israeli Druze are giving different vibes and different point of views. In the case of Walid Jumlad, the powerful Druze Lebanese leader, he considers that the Druze should be within the umbrella of the new Syrian regime, and in a way they should play along with the so-called Sunni presence. In the case of Israel, with the religious leader, Muwaffaq Tarif, he's saying that Israel has a kind of sacred duty to come to the aid of the Druze, which they did by launching a couple of airstrikes. So all of this, also given the role that Turkey plays and the whole minority issue, makes this confrontation between the Druze and the new Syrian regime very controversial and very critical, because the way it will end will dictate if Ahmad al-Shara is able to deal with this challenge as Ahmad al-Shara, as a president, or as a head of the militia, which he used to lead.
Could you explain that to us a bit more? Because you're suggesting that he doesn't have full control over his own followers.
Well, we're not only suggesting, we know for a fact that the way they put together the new Syrian army was not organic. They simply decided that this is a new Syrian army. They gave different factions different names, while in fact they did not create a kind of a national ideology or a fighting doctrine. So I am not accusing them of anything, but rather describing that in the last confrontations between the new Syrian forces and the Alawite coastal areas, it was clear that these troops used excessive violence. Usually, official armies do not punish, but they rather contain. In the case of Shara, we feel that there are competing ideological and military currents under his command, and he's only someone who is leading rather than deciding what will happen. And this is very controversial, especially that there are rumors as well as proof that the so-called foreign legion fighting with Al-Julani and later on part of Al-Shara government makes it somewhat of a scarecrow, meaning that you have the Uzbeks and these non-Arab Muslim fighters, some from Shishan, Chechnya, and all of this. This is something which the Druze have in front of them, and it's very hard to convince them otherwise.
Well, you say that there are these foreign fighters, but we also know that when we had the violence on the coast, much of it was perpetrated by factions from the north supported by Turkey. Not that Turkey was supporting that violence, but these are Turkish supported groups that have more typically been fighting the Kurds, but then turned their guns on the Alawites. Were these people not also involved in the violence against the Druze? Because that's what we're hearing, and we've seen some very disturbing images, in fact,
Yes.
of Druze having their mustaches shaved off by force, things like that. How much of this is actually happening, and how much of it is disinformation? Because what triggered this latest spate of violence, as we understand things, is this fake video that was circulated of a Druze sheikh allegedly insulting the Prophet Muhammad. So there seems to be an attempt here, really, by malign forces to foment this violence.
By all means, trying to justify this by using the conspiracy theory is not implausible, meaning that there's many factions which benefit from spilling of blood. We don't really know exactly what are the factions involved in the fight. And quite ironically, we do have some small Druze factions on the side of Julani, or what we call the General Security Forces. By all means, what happened or the pretext of this confrontation is not important as much as the fact that we saw it coming. I personally was seeing this because of the rhetoric coming out of the Syrian Druze, particularly one of their elders, one of their religious leaders, Sheikh Hakmat al-Hijari, who is in Suwaida. He continuously refuses to acknowledge Ahmad Shara's government. And thus, these confrontations in these two areas, which are far away from the main Druze enclave, was somewhat expected. And these fake videos or real videos indicate that there's a very fragile political environment between different factions. We have the Alawites, we have the Druze, and you don't know if the Kurds will be next, because even though the Kurds have acknowledged that they want to play along, the recent conference in the Qamishli proved otherwise. So all in all, I am not doubting that Ahmad Shara might have his heart in the right place, but it's very hard to build a state on their own. And I think that Shara and his militia turned army need to reach out and to ask the Syrian people for help. We do not expect that there is a kind of an existential threat against the Druze, but these images coming out of Syria is an indication that perhaps in a way that the keeping of sanctions against Syria might not be a bad idea, especially that the political process put forward by Shara is not transparent and the timeline is not that clear. All of these are indicators of more troubles to come.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
You mentioned at the beginning that you had the Walid Jumblatt, the Lebanese Druze leader, on the one hand, supportive of Shara, and then the guys in Israel, and Israel itself, of course, who is obviously trying to exploit these fissures because it's openly hostile to Shara and has certainly made some very audacious moves ever since the fall of the Assad regime, moving into the buffer zone, continually attacking Syria. I mean, who is in a position to fix this, as it were? Do you believe the United Nations should be involved? Who can be the honest broker and fix this?
I don't think we need an honest broker because everyone knows what should be done. First of all, resorting to excessive violence to protect themselves or to try to punish the Druze from the Shara side doesn't change much. It will only set a precedent of bad blood. The problem is that all people involved here, be it Netanyahu, and here I distinguish between Netanyahu and the Israeli state, because the Israeli state, or perhaps the Israeli army and the intelligence apparatus, definitely want to come to the aid of the Druze as a kind of a favor to the Israeli Druze. However, the involvement over the last 2 days indicate that Netanyahu is not really serious. Netanyahu, at the end of the day, doesn't care about Jewish blood. Why would he care about Arab Druze blood? And he hasn't given any sort of a clear indication that he's willing to commit the Israeli army. And it's actually very hard to get the cabinet to do this. At the same time, yesterday, when the Druze areas were being attacked by Shara, all of a sudden, Turkey announced that it will allow Netanyahu to fly over Turkey on his trip to Azerbaijan. So all of these indicate that Netanyahu, like his typical self, will continue to exploit innocent blood, be it Druze, Syrian, or even Jewish blood. So all in all here, I don't think that external mediation or external intervention, be it in the form of Netanyahu or through other Druze components in the area, will change much. Everyone knows what is needed. First of all, there should be a clear roadmap and a kind of, I don't want to call them affirmative action moves, but they should explain not only to the Druze, but rather of the rest of the Syrian people how long until a proper system is created. Second, and more importantly, if you take a look at the optics, when you see the forces of the new Syrian government fighting, you don't get the impression that they are a regular army. You have people who are still using their gardenome, and there are people still carrying their beards around. This is not a good indicator, and it will take time. However, up until that time comes, there should be a kind of a wise man's choice or wise person's choice, not to use excessive violence to prove a point. You're no longer trying to take Idlib to tell the rest of the people that you're in charge. Ahmed Julani is the Syrian president, and the Druze of Syria are Syrians before they're Druze, and they have a right and they have a sacred duty to protect the Syrian Republic in a way, because talks about secession are only something which a lunatic would do for many reasons. First of all, economically, it's not viable, and more importantly, geographically, the Druze enclave of Suwaida is disconnected from the occupied Golan and from Israel. So trying to create the state will only be creating another Kosovo or an unsustainable state.
Oh, absolutely. But, we also hear all this talk of a so-called David corridor that would connect the Golan to the Druze and on to the Kurds. And to me, too, all of that sounds pretty much like fantasy. But to get back to my question, I mean, you say there can be no honest broker, but what about the United Nations?
Well, to put it more clearly, I don't think that the ties have been severed completely between Ahmad Shara and the Druze. The people who are leading the refusal current or the objectionist current are known, but you have also factions from across the fence who are talking to each other. While Hikmat al-Hajari has taken a very aggressive position against Ahmad Shara, we have local Druze factions and leaders, be it the two religious leaders, Hamoud al-Hannawi and Yusuf Jarboua, they're in direct contact with Shara. So I don't think we got to a point where we have to phone a friend outside Syria in a way. If this comes, I don't think that the people that can play this game, or actually the Turks can play a game and the Americans can play a game, a positive role in this so-called mediation game. The UN does not really carry weight, especially that their presence in occupied Golan is just like hall monitors rather than enforcers of peace.
So basically, you seem to be saying that the regional powers are the ones who are in a position, plus the United States, to influence Shara's behavior and Druze behavior and get them to a point where some kind of accommodation is achieved.
I do agree on this point, that ultimately the Druze should not be caught in a kind of a regional international game, because small tribes should not meddle in the affairs of superpowers. And I believe that if they do, they will get stomped. And this is why at this point, I think these rounds of violence will transpire in a kind of a ceasefire. But one has to be very aware that if a fabricated or a real video can cause this fitna, could cause the civil war, maybe we should re-examine the whole system altogether.
But I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me that when we talk about Israel and Turkey, they have very different agendas. I do believe that Turkey desperately wants this government to succeed. It wants stability in Syria because it's, first of all, in Turkey's own interest that there not be renewed conflict in Syria and new flows of refugees. Whereas Israel has a completely opposite view. It wants to keep the place weak and divided. So how, in the end, it almost seems like this is that you need an accommodation between between Israel and Turkey, in fact, for things to get smoother in Syria.
This is where the Americans come in, because it's not a coincidence that Asad Shibani, the Syrian foreign minister, was in New York, and he was very positive in his approach to the demands of the Americans, be it the so-called peace with Israel, or basically the so-called foreign fighter element on all of these, and even the presence of Russia in Syria. So I do believe that ultimately America will have to lead in Syria, because as you indicated, the Turks and the Israelis, everyone has a different agenda. The issue is that the Druze are more geographically closer to Israel. It's harder and harder for Turkey to project power across these different areas. We do have some sort of a small Druze presence in Idlib, but this is contained in a way. The idea is that, and I've said this a number of times, Ahmad al-Shara should not turn into a Muhammad al-Julani every time violence occurs. There's a big difference between a militia dealing with a kind of insurrection and a government dealing with this. Usually the way to deal with it when you're president is through politics, not through the use of brutal force. I don't think that he should aspire to be another Hafez al-Assad or another Saddam Hussein. I think he has the eyes and ears of the international community as well as the region, and he actually cares about his image, which for me, is a very important thing.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully this will be resolved peacefully.
We always hope for peace to prevail and for innocent blood not to be spilled, especially over such trivial matters.
And this brings us to the end of our podcast. Thanks for tuning in. And for more in-depth reporting on the region, please go to our website, www.al-monitor.com.